I think I've known Kristen Anderson for about a decade, and she has such a breadth of knowledge. She's worked with John Hattie, she's worked with Doug Reeves, and much of her life in the last few years, she's dedicated to looking at teacher efficacy as a part of collective efficacy. And I like to call her the Brene Brown of education. But maybe we should call Brene Brown the Kristen Anderson of the rest of the world. Regardless, she has such deep knowledge about how to take care of yourself, how to be efficacious in what you do, and such deep knowledge about instruction, educational change. She's worked with so many people, she knows so much, and she's taught me a lot, an awful lot. And for example, Liz Wiseman is someone I learned about from Kristen and a number of other people. So I'm just grateful for Kristen, and I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. I'm looking forward to learning from someone I really respect and who has taught me a lot.
Hello, and welcome to this session on leadership well-being, creating the conditions for us to thrive and not merely survive. I don't know about you, but I know a whole lot of people, including myself at times, that feel like in this system, we are surviving, we are hanging from a ledge, trying to hold on instead of feeling like we're thriving and flourishing. And my goal in my work, my mission, my purpose is to help everyone feel like in this field, we don't have to survive. Survival does not have to be the norm. Thriving can be the norm. And so this session is designed to look at research that has been conducted over the last couple of years, both in a formal doctoral setting and since then in informal, more qualitative settings, to determine what makes us emotionally well and makes us emotionally unwell so we can move forward and do something about it. This is my contact information. I wanted to make sure you have this right out of the gate. If at any time you want to contact me about anything, this is my email address. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have or provide any support or resources. And you also see my artist formerly known as Twitter handle, which is now X. Any way, shape, or form you want to communicate, all the better with me. So I've noticed in our field, we are often whole student focused, and that is great. We want student social emotional well-being to thrive. We want our learners to be whole and well-rounded and flourishing in all aspects of their life. And that is right. And that is beautiful. And that is good. And I often wonder, well, what about the whole educator? What about the whole leader? Isn't there a connection between well students and well adults? And this desire to know more about that and the impact of what happens inside us and how it is perceived and comes out on the outside, that really led me to the research I've conducted. And I wanted to know what makes educators and educational leaders well and unwell, and really create a paradigm shift where we prioritize educators and we work not just to make them do more things or make leaders have more responsibilities, but actually work to help them thrive and flourish in the inside and as humans, which I have since learned leads to all the things we want to see on the outside. And a lot of people in the research have commented on saying that they feel left out in the well-being conversation. So an example of this is what you see here. You know, you have to take care of your students. You have to work on their social emotional learning. And I'm like, well, who's going to do the same for us? And I think as adults, there's just kind of this given, like you're an adult, you can figure it out on your own. And yet the volume of inputs and noise and items that can affect our well-being in leadership and educational roles is so astronomical that we need support to be emotionally well in the middle of what is quite a storm. So what is the storm? Well, the problem of practice that I have been exploring is this notion of many signs of not being emotionally well. And what are those signs? Not sure if you've been seeing them at your site or with some of the adults in your setting. However, some include not being so resilient, not bouncing back from setbacks very easily, not really being adaptable or dynamic or flexible, being very overwhelmed with everyday activities and the functions of the job, being really easily irritated and argumentative, and just really quick, I would say, to anger. I've seen that a lot in PLCs lately. And then, greater levels of fatigue, the body just feeling tight and tense, and sickness as well associated. More people calling out for sick days, loss of motivation, energy, input, loss of it, kind of a feeling of a sense of lackadaisicalness. Not really sure that's a word, but a sense of, really being laissez-faire and not really feeling in it anymore. I'm sure you could come up with a bunch of others. I mean, tears are a big one, constant streams of tears. In other words, there are many signs that the adults in our system are unwell. And why should we care about that? Well, I think, first of all, ever since the pandemic, it's becoming more and more socially acceptable because of the work of athletes in particular who have helped us to kind of understand and to see that our mental health really matters. So Michael Phelps is a really good example. Over the last few years, he came out and let everyone know that over his very impressive Olympic runs, he really struggled with depression. And it's something that he still works to manage. And he normalized depression in a sense and worked really hard to be vulnerable and own his story so other people could resonate. He realized that his mental health and the depression could have an impact on his performance, but also his personhood and the life he wants to lead. Naomi Osaka is another example, withdrew from major tennis tournaments that she was expected to do incredibly well in or win in order to focus on her mental health. And, much to many people's chagrin, she received a lot of flack for doing so and prioritizing her mental health. And yet she knew what she needed, and she made the bold and the brave decision to not try to please everyone, but to prioritize herself. And then there's Simone Biles. And, in the last Olympics, Simone actually withdrew from several of the gold medal contests that she was entered in and favored heavily to win because she was having the twisties. And she also received a lot of flack for not competing in those events and winning her country more gold medals. And yet she decided that her mental health would affect her physical performance, which could cause serious career-ending injuries. So she prioritized her health and her well-being. And as a result of doing so, who's laughing now? Because Simone Biles has just won another world championship. She's going to the Olympics again as one of the oldest gymnasts to ever compete in the sport. And she's thriving. I mean, they're making moves, they're naming new moves after her continuously, even in this stage. And so I really appreciate her story because focusing on us does not have to be at the exception of the results and what we want to achieve. And I think she's a really good example of sharing that. A lot of people think that even though these athletes and more famous people have talked about mental health struggles over the last couple of years, that it's all a result of the pandemic. And honestly, that's not true at all. The mental health has been an issue for some time. How do I know? Well, one bit of data, the US Census Bureau in May of 2020 published that 30% of Americans at that time were clinically diagnosed as anxious or depressed. What's fascinating about that is to get a clinical diagnosis, you have to go through many meetings and steps. And so you couldn't just in March of 2022, all of a sudden in 1 month become clinically diagnosed as anxious or depressed and show up on MAID data. This was pre-pandemic data. Likewise, the CDC noted that in 2021, deaths of despair had increased by over 80,000 in 10 years' time. And again, increasing significantly prior to the pandemic, and then the pandemic kind of putting it on steroids. To follow up on that data from the US Census Bureau, currently today it's estimated that if every American would get the help that they need with anxiety or depression, approximately 70% of Americans would be diagnosed as clinically anxious or depressed. And all of this to say, it's normal to battle with being unwell. It is not something that is different or makes us othered. It's actually a normal state. So that's important. And when we look at educational research, what we've learned is when compared to the general population, educational leaders and educators actually experience lower levels of general well-being, greater stress, greater anxiety, and more consequences of an overall lack of wellness. And so we know education is a field that people are even more unwell, depressed, or anxious in. It really matters. And it's time that we really started paying attention and doing something about it. What I'd love to invite you to do right now is just pause this webinar to answer this question, because before we can move any further, I think it's really important that we level set and get a common definition of well-being. So go ahead and pause, and then when you're ready, return and we'll move forward. So one of the big findings from my research is there are many different definitions of well-being. And in fact, almost every participant has a different definition of well-being. This is a snapshot that just highlights a few different definitions, and I'd invite you to take a look at these. So some people kind of define it as moral purpose or living the life that lets you know that you have meaning and purpose, making sure that you're functioning right, having balance. A lot of people even equate it to specific activities like spa, yoga, golf, going to the movies, going to dinner with friends, etc. And what we know is one of the reasons why there are so many different definitions of well-being is because the overall dictionary definition of well-being is actually doing that which makes you happy, because hedonism is the origin source of well-being. Well-being started with the notion of you are well when you do that which brings you great pleasure or makes you happy. And it wasn't until Aristotle came along where he said, yeah, it's about happiness, but it's also about something much deeper. And what he called it was eudaimonia. And that's the notion of the realization of two Greek priorities: to know oneself and to recognize our strengths, but also to bring them to fruition or to achieve the goals for why we are alive. And that added kind of the purpose aspect to well-being. So today, many people equate well-being to the balance of eudaimonia and hedonism, or the notion of doing that which makes you happy while attaining one's best self and best life and constantly growing. And so modern day researchers refer to well-being as human flourishing, like Martin Seligman, for example. And while this is all well and good, my question is still, all right, well, what does well-being mean? And another reason why I have that question is because there are actually 8 dimensions of well-being. When you talk about well-being and I talk about well-being, odds are we're talking about different sources or dimensions of well-being altogether. So I don't know if any of you have noticed that some of the adults in your system aren't well. And so you decided to host a meeting or a committee to determine what we could do for the adults to be more well on our site. So someone says, all right, well, here's what we need to do. We need to host a potluck, or we need margarita nights on Fridays, and then everyone will be well. What they're doing is they're coming at well-being from a social aspect. And they're amplifying the social dimension. Another person may say, we need yoga mornings on Tuesday and Thursdays, and then everybody will be centered and everybody will be well, and it'll really help. Well, they're coming from the physical dimension of well-being. And then another person says, no, we need a book study, because if we do a book study, we'll all be well. And that person may be coming from a dimension of intellectual well-being. The idea is that all dimensions are independent and they're interdependent, meaning connected to each other. However, there is one dimension of well-being that we have more control and more influence over in our fields. And that dimension of well-being is our emotional well-being, or what is sometimes known as our psychological well-being. Emotional well-being is defined as our ability to cope with everyday life and navigate change, which reflects how we think and how we feel about ourselves. People who are emotionally well are a bellwether in the middle of the storm. It's kind of like saying, okay, world, throw at me whatever you're going to throw at me, because I can be consistent and steady in the middle of all of these things that are happening around me. I like to describe emotional well-being as the difference between happiness and joy. So the Greek word for happiness is makarios. And makarios literally means freedom from normal cares or worries. So I am happy when something happens to me that alleviates some normal care. Like if I win the lottery, I am happy because it alleviated some financial concerns. Or if the Broncos could just win a football game, I might be happy because it alleviates another type of concern I have, which is growing bigger and bigger every day. That's happiness, waiting for something to happen to us. Joy, the Greek word for joy, is a word called kairo. And kairo literally means the steadfast good mood of the soul. And when we talk about emotional well-being, it is that good mood of the soul that makes it possible to survive when it feels, and not just survive, thrive, when it feels like there are things that are wrong around us, or there are many, many challenges. And that is my hope for everyone in education. I truly believe that if we could build the emotional and psychological well-being of all of our stakeholders, we would retain more teachers, we would retain more leaders, and people would feel valued, seen, heard, like they are loved and that they belong, and that they would have the tools they need to navigate the chaos that can be teaching and learning at times. So in my research, I really kind of broke down what contributed to a leader's emotional well-being and what took away from a leader's emotional well-being. And what contributed to it, I coded it as flourishers. And what took away from it, I coded it as inhibitors. And so you'll see here in this slide, this is a list of flourishers and inhibitors. And that was part of, my process was coding thousands of pages of transcripts to get to this notion of what causes emotional well-being to increase and decrease. And I added that to kind of a very deep literature review of what we know in the workplace contributes to and takes away from well-being. And it caused me to create, through all of these experiences, what I'm calling the leadership well-being theory of change. And basically, this looks like a lot. So I just want to break it down for you a little bit. The goal is not mastery here, just initial introduction. And the idea is this: all of the top boxes that feed the yellow box either cause our well-being to increase or decrease in the job. And then that increase or decrease has some pretty strong byproducts. So when we look at what causes a change or fluctuation in leadership emotional well-being, the degree of autonomy, voice, and input is very strong. Do I feel like my voice shapes decisions? Do I feel like I am an agent of my own journey, or do I feel micromanaged? Do I feel like my voice isn't seen or heard? Do I feel like I don't have very many or none opportunities for input? That kind of thing. Also, as part of this model, I've been able to determine that clarity of goals and progress for leaders is essential in being well. How do I know if I am making progress and I am making a difference and an impact? And the more clear the goals are and the success criteria for leaders, the greater the emotional well-being. Likewise, the number of job demands and stressors I have definitely plays a role in my well-being. As a matter of fact, it's not just the physical demands or the cognitive demands, the emotional demands, the emotional labor, and the inherited trauma that comes in this field also directly increases the number of demands and stressors. Job resources are, do I have the resources I need to be able to meet the demands and stressors? And that's not just physical, it's also the intangible, like time. So a lot of people in the study talked about how they have quite a few demands and stressors, and they don't have time to do the work to meet the demands or stressors. So it creates greater angst, fear, frustration, all of the above. Another large contributing factor that I discovered to emotional well-being in leaders is interpersonal relationships. And do our relationships breathe life into us, or do they suck the life right out of everyone in the room? There is also the work-home interface, which is significant. Work influences home, home influences work, and that all affects our well-being. Even if we try really hard to create boundaries, it infiltrates from a little thing called emotional contagion. And then finally, there's this category of personal resources. And personal resources are what we have inside of ourselves that help us realize that state of the good mood of the soul, steadfast bellwether, even if all the other components that you see that contribute to a change in leadership, emotional well-being are struggling, one's personal resources can be so high that it can still create that sense of well-being. So I want to show you what those personal resources are. This is a list of some of them. But what is in us that can be so strong that it can help us weather the storm? Well, the degree that we have hope, self-efficacy or belief in ourselves and our capabilities, how resilient we are, how optimistic we are, and not toxically positive, just looking to a better future and a better state. Having high self-compassion or speaking to ourselves as someone we love instead of our own worst enemies, how vulnerable we allow ourselves to be, and therefore, do we put ourselves in learning spaces and conversations that are authentic and want to keep being dynamic or growing as a result of that vulnerability? The extent to which we have habits and how those habits help us achieve these or help us work to build our personal resources and how they help us to be more effective in the other domains. Self-regulation, can I control myself and my emotions? Our self-awareness, our agency or ownership and locus of control, actually accessing that. And then also courage. Courage is a very strong personal resource. Now, a couple of key learnings here then. If these elements in the system work together for good and there's a positive change in emotional well-being, that leads to increased well-being, better performance on the job, and actually a change in educator well-being and student well-being as a result. not to mention what I learned, increased student achievement. Likewise, if these indicators work for not so good, the notion is that they actually lead to burnout, and burnout affects job performance in a big way, or at least causes one to remain stuck and stagnant. And then there is a negative change as a result in educator and student well-being too. One particular study that vividly illustrates this is in 2019, the researchers went and worked with 3,000 middle school students and 1,000 middle school teachers. And they wanted to know what causes, is there a correlation between adults being emotionally well and students being emotionally well? So they gave well-being scales to the adults and the students at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the study. And they also collected achievement data. And what they found, hands down, was the teachers who were more emotionally well had students who were more emotionally well. And those students outperformed the students who weren't by over 50% on assessment measures that they were looking at. In other words, you could also say the same on the other side. Teachers who were not emotionally well had students who were not emotionally well, and those students did not achieve to what they were capable of on standardized measures. We can no longer live in this world where we pretend that what happens inside of us does not impact all the things we want in school. We don't just hide it, it ekes out, it oozes out, and other people inherit it. If we want well kids, it is time we prioritize well adults. So here's the thing. You notice that personal resources has an asterisk next to it. Well, that's because if we build our personal resources, it is possible, I indicated this a little earlier, it is possible that even though the other categories that lead to positive well-being are struggling, personal resources are the greatest source of emotional well-being we have. And so many people in my study actually had high personal resources, but had high demands and job stressors, lack of job resources, toxic interpersonal relationships, a lack of voice autonomy and input, no clarity of goals and progress, and yet they were still somewhat emotionally well. And that was because of the extent of the strength of the personal resources that they've built. Now, this is not a blame the victim framework. I do not want people living in systems that are not emotionally well and just accessing their personal resources to try to stay. So our work now has been focused on how can we create an emotionally well system that does all of these things in a positive way, and then works with its people to build its personal resources and develop what's inside of them so that we can work on us and the system can work on itself, and we would be an emotionally well network together. That's really the idea. So the one thing I'm sure you're noticing right now is this is not a silver bullet. You can't just say we want emotionally well leaders or teachers, and so what we're going to do is we're just going to focus on this for a quarter and everything will be done and fine and we'll move on to the next thing. This needs to be a purposefully planned, executed over a long period of time, integrated into what we do system of being. And I believe if we hold on to it, we might be able to save the field. It's pretty significant. For those of you who do want a silver bullet, there is something you can do that will increase your well-being by 27% every day. So all you have to do is just watch this video. And if you watch it, your well-being will be increased by 27% per day. Go ahead and take a view. So studies show if you watch a beaver eat cabbage for a minute every single day, you will become 27% more emotionally well. That is absolutely not true at all. I just felt like it would be a funny thing to do. Plus, every time I look at this beaver eat cabbage, I can't get enough of it. So, that said, our well-being hinges on owning our locus of control. If there is one thing, one place to start, it is here. There is nothing that zaps our emotional well-being more than focusing our brain power on spaces that we cannot do anything to influence or control. We think about them a lot because we want to change them, so we're constantly identifying what we need to do. And what we know is all that brain power does nothing, because at the end of the day, it doesn't work to change anything. And so we don't feel like we're making progress when we focus on these things outside of our control, like what people think about us, what policies or procedures are in place, or if somebody's making me do something, what other people say to me, what they think of what I'm doing, those types of things. I can't control parents' actions. I can't control if students choose to engage a certain way. I can certainly set up scaffolds and procedures to help increase it. But at the end of the day, every person is their own person. I like to equate this to, I want you to think of a song that when you hear it on your device, you want to chuck your device out the window because you cannot stand to hear that song one bit. For me, that song is Walk the Moon, Shut Up and Dance with Me. No offense to Walk the Moon or that song, but every time I hear it, I want to say shut up and turn the song off. If we choose to focus on what we cannot control and what we cannot influence, it is like turning up the volume on the song we hate the most and letting that consistently play in our minds. It's like we're punishing ourselves for no reason. The people who are emotionally well, they say, I'm going to focus on what I can influence. I'm going to focus on what progress I can make. I'm going to focus on the things I know I can do that will make a difference. This is epic. And sometimes every one of us needs a reminder about this. The other well-being flourishers that really rose to the surface, I'm going to highlight 3 of them, which is instruction, personal resources, and relationships. And I highlighted personal resources a little bit. Let's start with instruction. Hands down, every leader who was interviewed, besides this framework that leads to well-being, they also mentioned that the very thing that makes them feel most emotionally well in systems is being close to instruction. So whether that is being in classrooms or being in PLCs or coaching or providing feedback or lesson planning and designing with teachers, any of those settings, including you see this district office leader who was in the study that talked about being in the actual buildings with actual kids and to actually see it. It's like this myth that instruction is happening because there's so much management that has to happen. And yet every person in the study, hands down, said they were most emotionally well when they were close to instruction. And it really got me thinking, this is incredible. Because a lot of times in our lives, if we want to be more well, we have to sacrifice something, right? Like if you want to be more thin or healthy, you should sacrifice the Haagen-Dazs, or you should work out more and sacrifice the resting time. But here, if you want to be more well, you have to do the thing you love, which is get your booty in the classroom, get in the discussion with the teachers. The national average that is estimated currently of the percentage of time that leaders spend in instruction in schools and districts is only 8% of their time on instruction. And we are never going to get to 100% of our time on instruction. We have to manage, we have to be transformational leaders in certain senses. There's a huge scope of our job, yet we can always get a little more time in instruction, and it does us a whole lot of good. So a couple of questions for you as you kind of process this, which is, how often are you able to be close to instruction? Is it as frequent as you'd like it to be? What gets in the way of you getting closer to instruction? And what are a few moves you could make to get a few more instructional minutes so you can feel a little bit more emotionally well? Those are really the core questions. And so the other, and I would invite you, pause it for now and reflect on these as much as you want, because this is obviously key. The other flourisher that I wanted to talk with you about is a little thing called relationships. And when we think of relationships, here's what a few people said. They talked about having a best friend or multiple best friends at work. And the notion that when you have truly trusting relationships, you can close the door, you can vent if you need to, you can problem solve, you can get emotional support, you can flourish because this person sees you for who you are, allows you to be vulnerable, and helps get you to a better place, whatever it is that you need. And that is a lot when it comes to surviving in this field. In fact, many of the principals I've interviewed talk about networks of people that they've personally sought out and created in order to fuel their emotional well-being. And so it's interesting because there was just an article published in January 2023. The lead researcher comes out of the University of Kansas, by the way. And Jeffrey Hall and team wanted to determine how conversations impact well-being and daily quality conversations. And what they found was, hands down, daily regular conversations significantly increase one's emotional well-being, which just kind of echoes what I've been seeing in this space. And so even 2021 research shows that principals report higher levels of well-being when they have collaboration with and trust in their district leadership. So it's not even just having best friends at work, it's actually having healthy relationships and purposefully trying to create them. You know, your mom always told you to, watch out who you hang out with and make sure those people breathe life into you. And there's really something to that. In fact, your emotional well-being is depending on it. And so what can you do to build more significant relationships at work? And here are a few questions for you to kind of reflect on. How do you leverage relationships? Do you have them? Who do you rely on? Do you feel isolated or alone, which is very typical for most educational leaders because we feel like we can't have those networks. We have fear and anxiety around speaking our minds. And would you describe your workplace relationships as more toxic or positive? And, what's something you can do about it? What's a step you can take? So feel free to pause this and to reflect on that too, if you would like. One school that I work with, they have what they call RVPs, and RVPs are respectable venting partners. And everyone in the school has one. And the protocol is this: if you need to vent, you call your RVP and you head over. And when you arrive, you just vent. It's the safe space, you vent. And then at the end of the venting, the RVP says, do you want help? Do you want a hug? Or do you just want me to be here? In other words, do you just want me to listen? Do you want me to comfort you with a hug or touch? Or do you want me to help you problem solve and get to a better space? and whatever it is that they decide, which sometimes they just said, I just wanted you to be here. I just wanted you to listen. That continues to make all the difference in the world. Now, I can say with all honesty that the converse of a lot of these things are true. In the research, when we looked at well-being inhibitors, people who provide toxic relationships or negative interpersonal relationships were a huge pull negatively on well-being, as well as the number of job demands, the amount of time that they have to meet the demands, the lack of autonomy and voice, and the ambiguity within the district. And since I just ended in the positive sense with relationships, I want to talk about people and relationships at the workplace. So one participant from the district office said there are two types of people that diminish my well-being: people who don't do their jobs and people who are incompetent or don't know anything, who are playing in the role of a leader but aren't a leader. Isn't that fire? I loved how generous the participants have been in this research. And then a school site leader said, if you would have told me that my biggest challenge, as in threat to my well-being as a principal, was going to be getting teachers to behave, I would have told you were nuts. I thought it would have been teaching and learning. It wasn't, not at this school. Now, everyone's school is different, but that is getting better. But that was definitely an emotional toll on my well-being, because people can be exceptionally difficult to deal with. If you're struggling with the toxic interpersonal relationships, getting some best friends at work is even more critical. And I don't mean, besties that you travel with outside of work all the time, just someone you feel like you can confide in at work, and a network you can build for proactive decision-making and solution-oriented conversations, and that can try to ameliorate the impact of the toxic people that I know every school has and has to deal with. All of this to say, I wanted to just have you reflect on the ingredients necessary to impact emotional well-being, not just in the workplace, as you see in this model, but also particular to the principalship with instruction, how these things play out. And I just want you to, in close of this session today, what is something you're taking out of this session? My goal was to help you think about this in a greater way with a little bit more depth, instead of just thinking that there's a shiny, flashy object we can buy, or if we do some mindfulness activities, we can be well. This is the work, and the most important work that we can do, in my opinion. Thank you so much for listening to this session, and feel free to contact me anytime if I can be of any support or assistance. You are incredible, and I'm so grateful that we had this learning together.